it's been great to escape the Melbourne winter and come and experience a real British summer, which I think some of you are experiencing for the first time in some years. And it's also been really great to be able to attend a number of the sessions. I've learned from that, it's been very stimulating, and I feel that what I say will resonate with some people. Maybe it will be a little foreign to some others because education is a broad school. But anyway, I hope everyone enjoys what I have to say. Let me say a few more words about where I'm coming from. My work is forged in the nexus between education and youth research, and through an interest in practice and policy in those areas. So my talk draws on a number of sources, and in particular on what I've learned from the Life Patterns longitudinal study, which is a two-cohort panel study that corresponds to generations X and Y, that I've been running out of the Youth Research Centre since 1991. So that's a long time. The longitudinal perspective that I've been able to gain from this work is actually quite unique. And in particular, it provides a really interesting insight into the goals, the expectations, the aspirations, and the realities in real time for these young people. And that's a really important thing to have, because we often project what might happen, or we use aggregate statistics to look at broad patterns, but the longitudinal research allows one to actually disaggregate and look at real trajectories and real lives, and look at what happens against what people hoped for and wanted to happen. Youth researchers, one whole bunch of educational researchers, are often puzzled that young people disappear in educational discourses, replaced by aggregate statistics, a focus on normative patterns and on the creation of nationally and globally comparative metrics of educational measurement. And on teaching content, I have to say, is it about literacy or numeracy? Educationalists, in turn, are often dismissive of the way in which youth researchers analyse young people's experiences to understand educational processes and outcomes, including their experiences in schools and in families and beyond school, to reflect on what school is doing for young people. So the intersection of these two fields, although sometimes problematic, I believe is actually a very productive one, and I hope to illustrate this in my talk today. The topic of youth transitions in difficult times invites a closer look at the way in which young people are in fact positioned through concepts and language that we use in education and economic discourses. The transition through education and beyond is a central preoccupation of both education and youth research. And increasingly I'm seeing a convergence in thinking that the frameworks that have dominated the last quarter of a century of thinking in both these fields are no longer providing the traction that we need to address chronic relationships of inequality and to address the deepening problems of transition. So to this end, I'm going to draw attention to the dominating spatial metaphor of transition. I want us to think about transition as a metaphor, not just as a word. And the emerging sense of a relational metaphor of belonging as a way of opening up thinking about the links between education and life. So we have to all be aware that recent events, including the global financial crisis and the collapse of the nexus between education and work in many countries, have brought old anxieties and tensions about youth transitions to the fore. So we all want to talk about youth transitions because they're a problem. Neoliberal government policies have constituted education as a central arm of neoliberal economies and productivity policies, on the assumption that high levels of education will generate economic outcomes for young people, jobs. And I'll come back to this many times. So education has actually been positioned as a rightful investment by individuals through the parallel assumption that educational credentials will bring the rewards of secure, fulfilling work and income security. Yet the paradox is, even for the educated, the links between education and the labour market are quite problematic. and they have always been so. Although aggregate figures such as school completion, employment, and income, regardless of the quality of the employment or the security of the income, create smooth lines on graphs that suggest a smooth transition process. In relation to real lives, transitions appear incredibly messy, contingent, unstable, and precarious. And this represents a very real challenge for educators and for educational policy. I found this cartoon early in the process of preparing my talk as I worked on these issues on youth transitions in uncertain times, and I became aware of how incredibly apt it was, not just because it's a difficult transition process, but because youth is constituted by social processes, and in a strange way this cartoon alludes to that. It actually alludes to the fact that difficulties that are in young people's lives don't just sit around outside them, they make what it means to be a young person. So in exploring youth transitions in difficult times, I'm going to firstly highlight some of the dimensions of these difficult times, and then secondly, I'm going to take you through a critical view of the way in which the nexus between education and work is conceptualised through the metaphor of transition, and then thirdly, I'm going to look more closely at the role of education in difficult times through some different conceptual frameworks. Now, I'm speaking to these issues on the understanding that this is a space about ideas, that this is concerned with the bigger picture of exploring issues that are central to the educational imagination. And I want to argue that now is actually a really crucial time for educational work that provides a vision for a future, a more positive future. A vision that catalyses the policy and research imagination and does not cede all this space to research that is about short-term, applied and instrumental answers. And here I echo my colleagues Lynn Yates and Bob Lingard, who have done so much to hold this kind of space open. And as Helen Gunter's keynote on Tuesday reminded us, sometimes doing this kind of work requires being a little brave and walking up the stairway, or I'm not sure whether it's up or down for me, but walking up the stairway without a banister. So you're kind of not holding on to anything much, but trying to forge your way through, which I feel I am doing a little bit in this talk. Transition is a complex issue then that lies at the very heart of education policy. What is the point of educating young people if their education doesn't enable them to gain satisfying, stable employment and establish a life and be well? Until recently, it seemed that only the marginal and disadvantaged who failed to bridge education and work experienced difficult transitions. These were almost, over the last 25 years that I've been doing this work, this has been the same group. In Australia, it's young people who are poor, young people who live in rural areas, and young Indigenous people. So in different countries, you might want to layer different groups into that, but it will almost always be the same groups of people. So I guess there's one question there. If our educational approaches haven't delivered some results on this in a quarter of a century, there is a need to do some rethinking. Yet, even as this nexus between education and employment, I was going to say, in fact, these exceptions have proved the rule, and they've been an important group to prove that education works, because it apparently works for the majority. It is assumed that if the young people in these marginal groups then would only mimic the patterns of participation of their more privileged peers, they would naturally find secure, worthwhile jobs. And yet, even as the nexus between education and employment has weakened, the belief in education as a tool to ensure middle-class prosperity in what Brown, Lauder and Ashton call the global auction of jobs has remained incredibly strong. UK researchers have been at the forefront of analysing how anxieties about this nexus have led to high-stakes choices about schooling. As transitions have become jeopardised, increasingly fine-grained differences between schools are pored over by parents to gain a competitive edge for their child. And I must say that in Australia, the policy of school choice has become a way of managing incredible risks by putting responsibility onto parents to make the right choices for their children. There's, for those who are interested and haven't caught up with this quite sobering book, The Global Auction. Now, the next couple of slides are just images of young people at the most recent open day at the University of Melbourne. And they're just serving as a backdrop for reflecting on the fact that educational participation is increasing, and this is a really important policy position in almost all countries. So firstly, increasing educational participation is in fact a key economic policy of governments. In fact, it's a surrogate economic policy in attempting to ensure that countries keep pace with global economic developments and global labour markets in a context in which national sovereignty is actually weakened. So it's a national policy always, but it is in an increasingly complex global situation. And there are key elements in the current Labor government, I guess soon not to be a Labor government in Australia, that support global policy discourses in global organisations such as the OECD. So education is a very significant investment by governments aimed at the goal of increasing economic competition. This is just a slide that shows the levels of increased participation across almost all countries. So it's just there for you to see, it's going up. So there's a huge investment in the idea that everybody should get at least a post-compulsory education. And underlying these statistics is the reality that education is also a very high priority for young people. My longitudinal study of young Australians and the comparison that I've been able to do with young Canadians in the Paths on Life's Way study by Leslie Andres confirms that investment in education is driven by the belief that increasing education qualifications will improve market competitiveness. So education is definitely seen by young people as well as a way, and their families, as a way to get secure employment and to get a job they can contribute to, that they're interested in, that will be worthwhile and valuable. So that's the book that has come out of, one of the books to come out of the longitudinal study. This is one that compares young Australians with young Canadians as they're going through this important period of time, both in terms of both countries, but also in terms of their own lives. So what this book actually helps to outline is that the crisis for youth that has been precipitated by the global financial crisis and recession is actually not a new problem. The nexus between education and work has since the 1990s in many developed countries been very difficult, even for the educated. So our longitudinal study shows that the transitions in the 1990s and 2000s took much longer than they anticipated. In fact, I have to say, at the time that we were recording this, we were scratching our heads because the rhetoric was still about, education leads to jobs. It's really worthwhile to get an education because you're so much better off if you do. And indeed, overall, people who get an education do have slightly better outcomes, but it wasn't the picture that they anticipated, nor was it what we expected to see. And I'm interested to see now that, looking back, it's being recognised that that has never been delivered in the way that it was intended. Well, they struggled through that. So this generation that's recorded in this book, they were the pioneers, 1991, they were the pioneers of mass tertiary education. They were the first ones to enter in such large numbers into this bargain that you have to get on getting further and better educated. So it took both the Australians and the Canadians a good 10 years after graduating to find satisfactory employment. And initially, many of them were very disappointed in the quality of work they found. So the high-skill knowledge economy was pretty slow to deliver, and now there's a lot of reflection on the idea that it hasn't actually happened that way at all. For them, the high-skill knowledge economy was very slow to emerge, if at all. So although the exact nature of this story varies from place to place, the latest economic recession has in fact exposed the fragile nature of the assumed links between education and employment. There is a sense in which especially in times of economic precarity, the educational strategy is selling an impossible dream. Here I refer to Lauren Berlant's notion of cruel optimism. Her book, published in 2011, explores how people navigate situations of overwhelming incoherence and precariousness, and how they develop strategies for survival and modes of adjustment for getting by when good life fantasies, as she calls it, are no longer sustainable. And she raises a really important issue for us as educators. What is the promise of the future? What are we educating for? And are economies able to deliver what they promise? Because it implicates us as educators hugely. Exploring related issues, Brown, Lauder and Ashton's book, The Global Auction, analyses how the investment by individuals has not been matched by the other part of the neoliberal bargain, the promise of jobs and rewards. So in the global competition for jobs, the value of knowledge has failed to materialise. Instead, young people are faced with high-skill, low-wage labour market. And I noticed while I've been here that there's been a couple of articles in the newspapers about this puzzling development in the UK around the high-skill, low-wage outcomes for people. So the next few slides just look at what this looks like on a more global scale. This just shows that unemployment rates rose between 2008 and 2012. So we've entered a situation where unemployment for young people is on the rise and not looking like going down anytime soon. I just really want you to get the flavour of that. You don't have to analyse it in any detail. The International Labour Organisation argues that globally, youth unemployment rates are worsening. Behind these patterns, there is a very complex picture of inequality within and across national boundaries. And unemployment rates also, they don't take into account underemployment, informal work, discouraged job seekers who are no longer in the labour market, or as people like to call them, NEET, nor does it indicate the quality of work. Aggregate figures on unemployment in Australia show a relatively low rate compared to other countries, but I know that within that there's 50% unemployment in some regions. That's in Australia, where things are apparently faring quite well. That has huge implications for young people, and you'll be very aware of the places where you work and where you live, that there are pockets and quite large areas of long-term unemployment where people haven't had a job for several generations. So youth transitions in difficult times are reflected in massive inequalities within and across countries. And it's also important to acknowledge, while we're getting incredibly gloomy about this, that the meaning of jobs is also changing. Professional and job titles such as manager, consultant, engineer, maybe teacher, no longer tell us as much as they used to about income, job security or career opportunities, or even where these jobs are, because it's a global context. Indeed, quoting some of the themes in Berlant's Cruel Optimism, Brown, Lauder and Ashton refer to the opportunity trap, in which people are forced to spend time, effort and money on activities that may have little purpose in achieving their goals. The stakes are high because the safety nets that once caught the marginalised and excluded are now threadbare. I just thought you might be interested to know, I'm not going to, this is just world and it just shows there's a range of things happening, but the areas where unemployment rates are projected to increase over the next period up till 2018 and presumably beyond are the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, East Asia, South Asia and parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, and of Latin America and the Caribbean. So large proportions of our planet are going to see young people doomed to very high rates of unemployment. They are predicted to remain level, that's quite high at the moment, level or decrease possibly, that in developed economies, and I would assume, you can assume who they are, and the European Union. and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean. So these inequalities in employment opportunities are part of complex transnational relationships that impact on us all. And I just want to note that young people, I'm not putting up the figures because I thought it might get confusing, but young people are very disproportionately affected by these unemployment rates. And the upward trend in global unemployment continues to hit them most strongly. The effect of these circumstances are that the concept of youth transition is being stretched until it is almost meaningless. And the reality of finding work becomes lost for many. In these countries that I've got on the screen, it's a matter of years, not months, to find work. And when this reaches beyond 5 years on average, we get a sense of the hopelessness for young people. And perhaps the inadequacy of our frameworks of transition for making sense of this, because this is what we do have to do. It is incumbent on us to make sense of the context in which our education is happening. Clearly, the concept of school-to-work transition is a fantasy when the average time for bridging education into employment takes this long. And this is not just a matter of difficult transitions, it's a breakdown in the link between education and employment. It's also important to note that when you disaggregate, you do get really significant patterns of inequality. So, for example, women are more frequently overeducated than men. That's a new category that's come up, the overeducated. I hope none of us are in that category. And studies conclude that women have a higher skills mismatch risk than men. So there's already these categories and terminology coming into the picture. We might want to take note of that, we might not. But I do want to comment that in Australia, if the current age patterns of earnings prevails into the future, a postgraduate woman aged 25 years can expect to earn just 2/3 of her male counterparts' lifetime earnings. And more strikingly, the fact that women with postgraduate qualifications in Australia would earn only as much on average over their lifetime as men with a certificate or Year 12 qualification. So we do need to ask the question of who's getting the value out of these qualifications and educational trajectories and why. I guess these outcomes point to the political dynamics that reproduce inequalities regardless of educational qualifications and regardless of the aspirations and hopes of young people. I know that the gendered inequalities in Australia are inconsistent with the hopes and aspirations of the young men and women in my study. I know because I spoke to them when they set out, the women did not intend to be left behind. They were ambitious. They wanted to have those good jobs and they wanted to be able to remain connected with the labour market, but things don't turn out that way. Not for reasons to do with them making choices necessarily, although they do call it choice, but because there are other factors at work. There are, of course, significant effects of these developments that need to be taken into account. So the effects are, I would actually say these are important areas to research. We need to know more about this. What are the effects of the longer search time in poorer quality jobs? The scarring, they call it scarring because there is a cumulative effect of these conditions on young people. Loss of earning power, distrust of socio-political and systems. How can we blame young people for not wanting to vote when they don't seem to be represented in governance, truly? And just in the resources to build a life. What we documented in our study in Canada and Australia was actually the lowering of fertility rates and marriage rates because people just couldn't find the basic things to hold a life together in time. And in fact, the young Australians never caught up. The government actually introduced a baby bonus to encourage people to have babies because the rate went down so low. And we're also beginning to research the cumulative effect in terms of mental health problems on young people. When goals and aspirations and realities don't meet up, there is stress, there is anxiety, there is depression, and we're seeing high levels of those things occurring in our young population. And in our longitudinal study, we are mapping these kinds of things around mental health as well as physical health. So I'd just as an aside say that these would be really interesting things to know more about. So Youth transitions is not a new problem. The same groups of disadvantaged have for the last quarter of a century been the subject of policies aimed at bringing them into the mainstream. This means that for at least 25 years, as I've alluded to earlier, much the same groups of the population have fared incredibly badly in relation to key measures of transition: academic achievement, school completion, post-secondary educational participation, and full-time employment. The problem is increasingly complex, and in some respects it seems outside the control of national governments, which does create a challenge. In an era marked by transformations in the nature of work, new communication technologies, and unprecedented levels of mobility of capital, of people, information and ideologies across national and cultural borders, the role of education in transition processes is increasingly complex. New forms of connectivity are emerging for young people, bringing new patterns of living, forms of belonging and citizenship, and aspirations, especially in relation to education and employment, as well as bringing fears about cultural change and nationhood. So I just want to go a little more into what some of these complexities are. Inside this circle lives 45% of the world's young people. The metaphor of the Asian century refers to the global implications of the expansion of Asian economies, creating, amongst other things, a new middle class seeking and creating educational opportunities, both in terms of reaching out to other parts of the world, but also competing, establishing high-quality educational institutions that will almost do now and will outrank the best in the rest of the world. So these forge patterns of production and consumption that really will have global impact. For one thing, highly educated graduates in these countries compete for jobs around the globe. There are, in fact, as Lauder and his colleagues argue, no UK, Australian, United States, etc. jobs, just workers. Workers are now engaged in a global competition for work, and workers can be anywhere and recruited from anywhere. In fact, the economies in China and other parts of Asia have leapfrogged the developed countries, partly by engineering the link between education and economic needs, not leaving it to market forces. And another image of the Arab Spring, raising the expectations of those who invest in themselves, combined with the visibility of lifestyles to aspire to, creates an explosive situation. New inequalities locally and globally are being created, and a great many young people feel alienated from their communities, their aspirations often thwarted by institutions that promise more than they're able to deliver. So I want to just now have a chance to reflect on that. I guess education and work, I'm trying to establish, are both transnational processes. They're separate fields, education and work, but their relationship is variable. We can't assume what the links are. It's changing, and I suspect it's very little understood, especially by educators. However, business as usual will not serve education into the next phase, which maybe some are calling after neoliberalism. So I want to ask you to reflect on the message so far. This is actually an image of a place where I like to go to reflect. It's in the northeast of Victoria. We can stand at the edge of the foothills and look out over the vast plains that seem to stretch right across to Adelaide. So the evidence I'm presenting so far is actually kind of presenting a picture of crisis. I don't know that it is, but I guess the future will show. But it does seem overwhelming. National educational policies are designed to enable countries to be internationally and globally competitive, but these very global forces mean that national governments appear to have very little control over conditions that would enable young people to have a good life. The neoliberal contract has only ever delivered the promise of good work for the educated in a piecemeal way. Even this partial link is breaking down as the educated have long transition times. Youth transitions have been a challenge for education for the last 25 to 30 years, and although measures and technologies for auditing transitions through education have become increasingly sophisticated, they have not delivered better educational outcomes, greater equality or social justice, and neither are they capable of doing these things. What's missing from this picture is a robust discussion of the role of education in difficult times, of global transformation in education and labour markets. So I think my way of doing this is actually to unpack the idea of transitions that's used centrally in both education and youth studies, because this wonderfully simple metaphor of transitions that we take for granted structures the way we think about the relationship between young people learning and the state, about who benefits, who is responsible, and where young people belong. Okay, I'm going to be a bit on about metaphors now. The neoliberal bargain of investment in education for labour market advantage is actually woven into a spatial metaphor of transition. So let's look at it a little more closely. As the youth labour market collapsed in the 1980s onwards, the idea of transitions came into widespread usage and in education and youth research. We started to see the use of supporting metaphors like routes, pathways, trajectories and navigations. Furlong and Cartmell's classic analogy, comparing the changes that were occurring in youth transitions to changing modes of transport, from the structured transitions of an earlier period, the train, where you could get on board the train and you know where you get off, it was all was regulated and you knew where you were going, to the car, which you drive yourself and you can get lost and it can break down. It's a vivid example of the transition metaphor. But at the centre of these metaphors is the relationship of young people to new environments of education and work. A spatial metaphor of pathways is linear, so it's always going in one direction, which I guess you're all aware of if you've seen any of the any of the sessions I've been in. It doesn't look like that in life. It is normative, that is, there's a right way and a wrong way, and it's aggregated through individual statistics that give the appearance of something that works. There's another example. The spatial metaphor of transitions works at the individual level and at the institutional level. So if we look at this simple diagram, we can see how it provides a standard for individual trajectories and for the institutions that channel and measure these trajectories. Individual trajectories through school, post-secondary education and employment align with the natural developmental process of maturity from child to youth to adulthood. This aligning of assumed natural maturational processes with institutional trajectories obscures the complexity, obscures the political and economic nature of these trajectories. In particular, they obscure the complexity, they offer little traction on the processes that create inequalities and that might in fact create a vision of a better future. I want to say a couple of things about complexity and about gaps, because these are very important elements of this transition model. In fact, individual attributes, qualities, trajectories and needs are very messy and more hybrid and more complex than ever, as many educationalists are already arguing. They actually have always been so. There hasn't been a golden age where everyone was the same. Amongst the 17% of young Australians who do not complete post-secondary education, we see these messy lives. Young people who are carers of family, who have mental health problems, whose communities require significant commitments of time around cultural and community events, who are living independently, who are poor and who are dealing with more pressing issues than school. These complexities are washed out through what BERA calls the policyscape of formal, technical, rational procedures, clear-cut categories of people, and predictability and spatial boundedness. And that's what this model delivers. It delivers a nice clear-cut picture of how it's going and who's progressing according to the official standards. So the idea of transition, I would argue, has in fact become a technology for the creation of standards supported by techniques for measuring conformity to the norm of set markers of achievement, academically, through international registers of literacy and numeracy, and socially with regard to moving from school to earning or learning. With this focus, educational policies can continue to do business as usual, because all you need is that trajectory. You can just measure who's in and who's not, and it's a pity some are not, but we've got a lot of people in there, so that's fine, we'll keep going. In fact, this provides a way of managing what I would call everyday crises. There are bigger picture problems out there that this is not addressing. They focus on standard measures of academic progress, and they protect perhaps an outmoded ideal of choice, blaming those who don't make the right choices. And every education conference I attend, I attend papers where many people are documenting how this doesn't work, how this model is failing so many young people. The other important thing to note is that, amongst other things, this is a wonderful model because it produces this idea of the gap that has to be closed. So it's a technology for saying so many people are at this point. It's actually, if you just look at the linear model there, so many people are at this point, other people are not. That's the gap. The other people who are not there need to be brought up to standard. And there's a lot of work that's been done by many people, including Bob Lingard, David Gilbourne, many others, who have, Gloria Ladson-Billings, the number of people in education who've spoken out against this have been most voluminous. But it needs to be said again that this focuses on those who are not the mainstream and does nothing to actually explore the conditions that create that in the first place. It actually functions in terms of global policy as numbers, as Bob Lingard has explored in detail and as evidenced in a whole range of global measures such as PISA, PIRLS and others, which measure the progress of like schools. So you don't need to look at the context of the individuals, and student performance on national tests such as NAPLAN. So as my talk has hopefully brought home, the failure to recognise the social and economic conditions that create these patterns is now part of the problem. So policy responses look a bit like this. We're seeing the creation of new categories of youth. So these transition models enable us to identify who are the NEETs, let's call them that. Let's identify them, that'd be great. We can identify how far they need to come to measure up to the mainstream. We've got the overeducated and the undereducated. And strategies include a range of things that mainly focus on bringing those who are not in the mainstream up to standard. So I guess I'm wanting to say that the transitions metaphor contributes directly to policy responses that assume the outcome of education is employment naturally. Yet I'm going to argue that in our difficult times there's a challenge to educators to respond in a different way. The weakening of the nexus between education and work, which is going to be with us for quite a long time, does not mean an abandonment of this goal. It offers an opportunity to strengthen education through frameworks that are more suited to diversity, fluidity, uncertainty, precariousness, and contributing to the building of new contracts and partnerships that will make the shape of after neoliberalism. So let me now strike out. It's easy to criticise, but it's another thing to actually say, well, what would you do instead? So, my long-standing, as many of you who know my work will know, I've been a bit of a critic of the concept of transitions for a long time. And this has drawn me to consider the alternatives. And it's led me to be interested in a different metaphor. If the metaphor of transitions creating this linear normative process is so bad, what would we put in its place? A relational metaphor does enable us to ask different questions. Now this is not about replacing one orthodoxy with another. There's lots of things we do need to measure along that transitions line. It is, as Stephen Ball has argued, about understanding the work that theory does and being explicit about understanding what our conceptual frameworks open up and what they close down. And I argue that new frameworks are needed to support the engineering of solutions to the problems I've put before you today. So let me share some emerging ideas that have been shaping up around educational practices that address these pressing questions. Some of this is drawn from the work that I've done with my colleagues at the Youth Research Centre over many years, where we've been researching and evaluating and participating in educational practices that address the needs of the most disadvantaged, marginalised, disengaged and alienated young people in Australia and in our region, the Asia Pacific. In Australia, these young people are anathema to the standardised testing regimes that are imposed on schools, and increasingly they're not wanted in the aspirational mainstream schools that want to look good on the national websites, such as we've got My School. If they're lucky, they get diverted into one of the vast plethora of alternative programs that aim to keep young people connected to learning. And many of you will be familiar with these kinds of programs because I know there are many here in the UK as well. Well, we've found over the years that they do much the same thing, these programs. They build relationships of trust and connection in school and out. They give young people a sense of control about their present and a sense of possibility for their futures that makes learning meaningful. Now, these practices are actually not, I do the work, I do the measuring, I do the reports. I've found these practices are not of that much interest to governments or to the other organisations that fund alternative programs. While they recognise that these programs are needed, mostly what's wanted is to see the mainstream outcomes using the same metrics that are used to measure the progress of their more privileged peers. But the conventional measures of transition, academic achievement, direct transmission into further educational work, of course they use these measures, but they don't generate particularly useful data about what's going on. A relational metaphor shifts the frame of reference from trajectories and indicators of normative progress to the quality of the social, economic and political relationships that have supported young people's lives. Now, you have found examples of this in the rich legacy of the work of Pat Thompson and Helen Gunter, in John Smythe and his colleagues in Australia, who demonstrate how linking learning to community creates an enabling space. My colleague Helen Cahill, whose work is also illustrative here, demonstrating how learning partnerships between young people and educators enables both to improve their practice. And there are many others. I'll put this up here because this is about the 3 areas that we're trying to measure. There's been a lot of interesting debate in the conference about whether these are things that can be measured quantitatively or whether we need to just have narratives about them. Both are probably important, but in my work, this is where I'm heading. I'm working with a number of organisations to develop metrics that enable these things to be measured. So if the dominating transition metaphor asks how many and how many have not achieved indicators of progress, a relational metaphor asks, how do young people belong and where do they belong? What is the quality of the relationship of young people to schools and to their wider local and global communities, and how do we measure this? What is the responsibility of schools and communities and families to ensure that young people can belong? So, actually, I'm aware that I'm running out of time and I wasn't intending to go into a lot of detail on other examples of this, but what I would like to say is that from my experience, the programs that do this kind of work that are and have been for a long time operating under the radar tend to have the following characteristics. They take the shape of partnerships from the community, including young people, with government and the private sector, creating dynamic relationships that have meaning for young people, so young people can say, I belong here. And for communities, this is authentic. And it recognises who they are, it recognises people's past, present and future. It's their partnerships in which culture is important, not just academic credentials. There's connection, enabling connections across space and time, and control, enabling young people to have a sense of efficacy over their lives and what they learn. They're creative and adaptable, responding to local and global needs. The public sector plays a key role, especially with regard to financing and mobilising partners and recognising the need to integrate public services. And they build new models of governance because the old ones don't give enough accountability for where young people belong. The relational approach that underpins these practices is recognisable as the compensatory approaches that will close the gap in educational aspirations for traditionally low-achieving communities. Yet they are much more than this. As those who are familiar with the workings of elite schools know, this relational approach is well entrenched there. Elite schools, as my colleagues Jane Kenway, Fazil Rizvi and others are currently exploring in Australia and other countries, trade in connection to northern traditions of privilege and link students to southern hotspots of development, for example in China, building a sense of where and how these young people belong on a global stage. And in the expanding economies of the Asian countries, new elite schools are emerging almost daily with the promise of connection to the best universities in the UK, the US, Europe and Australia, and building that sense of belonging on a world stage again. But one of the lessons from the neoliberal experiment is that some things are too important to leave to market forces. And market forces will increasingly serve the needs of the elite. A relational metaphor for education is one that embraces lifelong learning and the integral connections that enable young people to belong and participate in civic life, including economically. So rather than focusing narrowly on set transition points and abstract notions of work somewhere out there, not knowing what it is, a new imaginary is needed in the increasingly globally connected world that young people already inhabit. So I'm going to end on a positive note. And as being a New Zealander, I've found some inspiration there. Let me provide an example of how connection, relationships, civic life and social developments are central to connecting education and economic development, enabling young people to belong. Malloy and Lana, in a book published this year called Fashioning the Global, identify how the fashion industry emerged from the ruins of the failed neoliberal government in New Zealand, analysing the rise of independent fashion design through 4 political projects that involved partnerships with government, industry, education and youth work. This book provides a really interesting insight from the perspective of social geography, as it happens, on how young people can come to belong centrally in difficult times. Through political projects that build networks of trust and affinity that underpin social capital. So fashion became a means of accessing marginalised young people and places, drawing them into the broader globalised economic and development processes. As Malloy and Lana emphasise, the success of this global creative industry is that it involved both economic and cultural reinvention. And these are both important projects for educators. These were, I'll just say very briefly, the globalisation project. Most countries have a globalisation project of some sort, materially and symbolically. It did emerge from the neoliberal notion of a knowledge economy. In fact, in this case, creative industries were positioned at the forefront of innovation along with biotechnologies and ICTs. But what this did was to actually form the apparatuses needed for self-regulation and new relationships with the state. So there are new forms of governance that start to bring these relationships together. And then creative cities, we're all aware of some model version of this where urban regeneration brings infrastructure to areas, and this particular area means that the responsibility will lie with regional and local government, not national government. And finally, social development. There was an emphasis on creating new conditions of social integration. Designer fashion became a means of building social capital and encouraging social diversity. So social development projects were positioned in spheres where particular community groups had already established social and cultural expertise, and this was often through leveraging off the kinds of things that were happening in schools. So I'm going to conclude. What I find especially interesting is that the examples presented in this book illustrate the potential of designer fashion as an activity around which new relationships between government, local authorities, schools and community organisations form through a new partnering governmentality. And finally, the space of youth transitions is a political and economic process that involves a particular imaginary. It is not a doomed space. It is one in which the inventions and experimentation that are crucial to a more promising future are made, but business, as usual, must be challenged. This is a time for educational researchers to incite the policy and research imagination. Thank you.